Oh, Doctor Who. For almost 60 years, the adventures of this time-travelling alien have fascinated viewers young and old. What began as an educational show for children that would keep families watching before the shows that were designed for the more grown-up audiences began would quickly transform into a show that whole families would really feel like they needed to gather together to watch, often with the children viewing the show from behind the sofa, like I am here, so that they could duck down and hide from the scary parts. Like this. It almost didn't happen, of course. The show was beset with obstacles on its way to the airwaves, and when it finally reached the point where filming could begin, its first episode had to be filmed twice. Why? Well, the original version wasn't what the high-ups at the BBC were exactly looking for. And then, of course, the night that the refilmed episode 1 actually aired was the night that President Kennedy was assassinated. So everyone was watching the news rather than this silly little kids show that had just aired. So it seemed like Doctor Who was doomed from the start. But as we all know, appearing to be doomed is just at the point where the Doctor always turns things to his advantage. And turn things around, he did. A show doesn't become the longest running science fiction TV show in history without having the ability to grab itself an audience and never let go. There's an unmistakable charm to Doctor Who that keeps people coming back time and time again. Once it's got its hooks into you, it doesn't ever let go. And it all started with this first story back in November 1963. So, my friends, let's see what this old show is all about as we begin our epic journey to review every single Doctor Who story that has ever been broadcast on television. I'm Zoe Kirk-Robinson, you're watching ShowHammer. Let's start Doctor Who. The opening story for Doctor Who is a surprisingly strong one that is still well worth revisiting even today. While the style and the flow of the first episode differs depending on whether you're watching the version that was actually aired on television or the version that was originally shot, because both still exist, the core of the story remains the same. Two of Susan's teachers are concerned about her and decide to investigate. This investigation leads them to the conclusion that all is not right at Susan's home, and they confront her grandfather about the matter. They think he's being abusive in some way, although they don't actually come out and say that, because, after all, this was the children's show in the 1960s, so what they could get away with was quite different to what you could get away with now. Instead of finding an abusive stand-in parent, however, the teachers discover that Susan and her grandfather are actually aliens, or time travellers at the very least. How this episode is portrayed on screen differs from version to version. For the unaired pilot, there's a really tense Cold War drama feel to the whole affair. The camera work and its pacing come together to present a rather moody and rather tense episode that looks and feels more like a film than anything that you would have seen for a first series in the 1960s. It's an excellent episode, and I personally thoroughly enjoyed it while rewatching it for this review. Although, funnily enough, when I first saw it, I preferred the version that was shown on television. The pilot version felt a lot slower to me back then, and more meandering when I first saw it, compared to the TV released version. The broadcast version is certainly faster paced, whether you've seen it before or are watching it for the first time. And in several scenes, the writing is definitely better. While the camera work and the tone of the pilot is superior, thanks to its darker, more spy-like film feel, the pace and the performances in the broadcast version are the superior version. It seems like the actors were more comfortable in their roles after having spent a week already filming the show, and that makes the episode pop more in this version than in the original. The writing has been tweaked as well. In the broadcast version, Susan doesn't claim to be from the 24th century. She says she's from another world. In this version, the Doctor confirms that he and Susan are aliens who are exiled from their home planet. The TARDIS is also knocked off course because Susan fights with the Doctor for control of the ship while he's taking off, which he's actually doing after fooling Susan into thinking that she can stay in the 20th century like she wants to. That's not in the pilot version. This all makes a lot more narrative sense for the show rather than what the pilot version did, which makes it the technically superior version of the episode. But whichever version you prefer, the results are the same for all of the characters. Ian and Barbara don't want to be in the TARDIS. The Doctor doesn't want them in the TARDIS, and everyone doesn't want to be in the Paleolithic era, but that's where they all are, and they're all stuck together, so they're going to have to make the best of it. This leads directly into the second episode, which is a kind of second episode 1 of sorts, although it is technically part 2 of a 4-part story, or at least that's how it's packaged now. What we really have is a completely different story to the episode 1 that we got, because now our characters are in a different place and a different time. It's the Paleolithic era, just as I mentioned a moment ago, and it's at a time when the Ice Age is forcing humans out of their hunting grounds in the north. The time travellers encounter a tribe that has lost the knowledge of fire because only their leader was allowed to know how to make it, and he died before passing the knowledge on. Back at the start of the show's development, the idea was that Doctor Who would educate children by having episodes where you go back in time to study history and then go to the future to study science. That's why there are 2 teachers as companions in this first episode. Barbara is a history teacher and Ian is a science teacher. So you'll see them mention facts here and there throughout their time in the TARDIS, whether it properly fits into the story or not. And there's a fair bit of that in this first story. But of course, what actually ended up happening was that once the camera started rolling, the time travellers went back in time to engage in fantastic, character-driven historical dramas before going to the future to fight aliens and rubber-suited monsters. There's a rule in military conflicts and wargaming that no plan survives the first encounter with the enemy. Well, on TV, no plan survives the first encounter with the audience. People tune in for the adventure, and if the production team want to keep their jobs, they give those people the adventure that they came for. The Paleolithic tribe is really well fleshed out, and the overwhelming majority of the actors give an amazing performance for this story. This is an excellent story of jealousy, greed, ambition, and the crimes that almost always come with those things. But it's also the story where our notable technical pacifist, the Doctor, tries to bash the skull in on a caveman because he's slowing down his escape. Characterization hasn't really solidified by this point. Nevertheless, we do get to see some glimpses of the genius Doctor that we would all come to know and love. There's an excellent scene where the Doctor gets the story's antagonist to implicate himself in a crime by playing up to the guy's ego. He takes the knife of the man's rival and proclaims, "This knife stabs, it cuts, I have never seen a better knife," knowing that the guy will get jealous and then proclaim that his own knife is far superior. But his own knife has blood on it. And this, of course, ultimately leads to the guy's downfall. Both William Hartnell as the Doctor and Jeremy Young as the antagonist Cal play this scene out perfectly. It is brilliant to watch. The camera work throughout parts 2 to 4 of the story never quite managed to give that feeling of trying to ape a film like the pilot episode did, but instead it's a far more sedate affair, and it comes across perfectly well and has absolutely no problems in telling the story. It feels like it's a shame that it wasn't quite trying to push the boundaries of what could be achieved with a clunky television camera from the 60s as much as the pilot episode did. Speaking of these episodes, in comparison to episode 1, there's hardly any lack of pace. It's a sad fact that many episodes of classic Doctor Who end up feeling a little bit stretched out to fill the time, or outright skippable, because literally nothing happens to move the story on forward at all. There's almost none of that in these 3 Paleolithic episodes. I think it's the interactions between the main cast that serve to achieve this the most. Ian and the Doctor are constantly at one another's throats, with Ian demanding that he and Barbara be able to return home, while the Doctor keeps insisting that he just can't let them. Now sure, they do eventually manage to put their differences aside and work as a team, but it's clear that they're all going to need an awful lot of time to get used to their situation and to one another. And as a result, their interactions help keep the episode running along at a fast pace. So all in all, this is a brilliant story, and it's absolutely worth revisiting. Doctor Who couldn't have got off to a better start than with this story. I'll give it 4 out of 5 TARDISes. It is well worth watching. But that is all the time that we've got for this week. So join me again when we'll be taking a look next time at the next adventure for the TARDIS crew. And it's one to remember, because Doctor Who's biggest foe is in it. Nope, it's not Michael Grade, it's the Daleks. See you then.
Ha 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 ha.
If you liked today's video, please consider supporting me on Patreon. And an extra special thanks goes out to Chief89 and Tepic. Thank you.